I've spent the better part of my 58 years wandering through cities, through texts, through the labyrinth of human behavior, and lately I've been haunted by a question that seems almost absurd on its surface. What would Diogenes of Sinope think of Donald Trump? Stay with me here. I know how that sounds. But bear with an old philosopher for the next 15 minutes, because what I'm about to propose might change how you see our current cultural moment. We live in an age of spectacle, of men who live their entire lives in public view, who seem to delight in offending sensibilities, who reject every social convention with theatrical flair. Donald Trump, Elon Musk, Andrew Tate, three men who couldn't be more different in their specifics, yet share something profound in their approach to existence. They are, I would argue, our modern cynics, not in the colloquial sense of being pessimistic or distrustful, but in the ancient philosophical sense. They are the spiritual descendants of Diogenes, who lived in a barrel, masturbated in the marketplace, and told Alexander the Great to get out of his sunlight. But here's the uncomfortable question we must grapple with. Is this philosophical courage, or is it merely trolling with a bigger platform? To understand what I'm claiming, we need to go back to Athens in the 4th century BCE, to a movement that scandalized the ancient world just as much as our modern provocateurs scandalize ours. The Cynics, from the Greek kynikos, meaning dog-like, were philosophers who rejected virtually every social convention of their time. Led by figures like Antisthenes and most famously Diogenes of Sinope, they believed that civilization had corrupted humanity's natural state. They saw social norms, wealth, status, and even basic decency as chains that prevented authentic living. Diogenes lived this philosophy radically. He owned nothing but a cloak and a wooden bowl, which he discarded after seeing a child drink from his hands. He lived in a large ceramic jar in the marketplace. He urinated on people who insulted him. When Plato defined man as a featherless biped, Diogenes plucked a chicken and brought it to Plato's academy, declaring, "Behold, I've brought you a man." But here's what's crucial. This wasn't mere performance art. The Cynics believed they were living according to nature, according to physis rather than nomos, nature rather than convention. They were conducting a philosophical experiment in public, asking, what happens when you strip away everything society tells you that you should be? Their method was Parrhesia, frank speech, truth-telling without regard for consequences. They believed that shocking people, offending them, even humiliating them, was a form of philosophical therapy. They were the gadflies of Athens, stinging the body politic into awareness. Sound familiar yet? Now let's leap forward 24 centuries. Let's look at three men who dominate our cultural conversation, often to our exhaustion. Donald Trump, a man who violated every norm of political discourse, who said the unsayable, who seemed to delight in the gasps of the establishment. He didn't just break the rules of political decorum, he performed their destruction. Every tweet, every rally, every outrageous statement was Diogenes plucking the chicken. You say a president must be presidential. Behold, I've brought you a president. Trump's genius, if we can call it that, was recognizing that the conventions of political speech had become so calcified, so divorced from how people actually think and speak, that their violation was itself a form of liberation for his audience. He practiced Parrhesia, frank speech, though whether it was truth-telling is another question entirely. Then there's Elon Musk, a man who bought the modern agora, Twitter, and immediately began urinating in it, metaphorically speaking. Musk embodies the cynic's rejection of conventional wisdom. You say we can't colonize Mars? You say electric cars are impractical? You say I shouldn't smoke weed on a podcast or name my child a keyboard sequence? Musk lives his life as a public experiment in rejecting limitations. Like Diogenes, he seems to own his rejection of social norms as a philosophical position. He's conducting his life in the marketplace, daring us to look away, challenging our assumptions about what's possible and what's proper. And Andrew Tate, perhaps the most overtly cynic of the three, Tate has built an entire persona around rejecting modern social conventions, particularly around masculinity, wealth, and power. He lives ostentatiously, speaks provocatively, and seems to measure his success by the intensity of the outrage he generates. Tate's message to young men is essentially cynic. Society has made you weak with its conventions. Reject them. Live according to your nature, which he defines as domination, acquisition, and unapologetic self-assertion. All three men share key cynic characteristics. They live their lives publicly as performances. They reject social conventions as arbitrary constraints. They practice a form of Parrhesia, saying what others won't. They position themselves as truth-tellers in a world of comfortable lies. And they generate intense reactions, devotion and disgust in equal measure, because they're violating taboos. But here's where it gets philosophically interesting and uncomfortable. The ancient Cynics rejected wealth and power. They lived in poverty by choice. Diogenes owned nothing. Our modern cynics are billionaires and millionaires. They don't reject power, they accumulate it. They don't live in barrels, they live in mansions and tweet from private jets. So what are we really looking at here? This is where we need to bring in Friedrich Nietzsche, that other great philosopher of provocation. Nietzsche admired the Cynics, but he also saw their limitation. The ancient Cynics rejected power, but Nietzsche argued that life itself is fundamentally about power, what he called the will to power. Not just political power, but the power to create, to impose meaning, to shape reality according to one's vision. Nietzsche would have recognized something in Trump, Musk, and Tate that goes beyond mere cynicism. They're not just rejecting conventions, they're attempting to replace them with their own. They're not living in barrels, they're building empires. They're not stepping aside for Alexander. They want to be Alexander. This is where the Cynic method meets the will to power. They use Cynic tactics, provocation, norm violation, Parrhesia, not to reject power, but to accumulate it. They've weaponized the philosophical stance of the outsider while occupying the ultimate insider position. Wealth, influence, control. Nietzsche also gave us the concept of the revaluation of all values. The idea that sometimes, to move forward, we must destroy the old moral framework entirely and create a new one. In his view, this was the task of the Übermensch, the overman who could create meaning in a meaningless universe. Our modern cynics present themselves as exactly this: destroyers of old, corrupt values, creators of new paradigms. Trump: I alone can fix it. Musk: I'm making life multiplanetary. Tate: I'm teaching men to be men again. But Nietzsche also warned about nihilism. The danger that comes when you destroy old values without creating anything meaningful to replace them. When you tear down without building up. When provocation becomes an end in itself. And this brings us to the central question. Are these men philosophers conducting a grand experiment in living authentically? Or are they nihilists, destroying for the sake of destruction? Or perhaps most troubling, are they something else entirely? Cynics in the modern sense, manipulating philosophical postures for personal gain. Here's what keeps me up at night. How do we distinguish between philosophical provocation and mere trolling? The ancient Cynics had a clear ethical framework, however radical. They believed in living according to nature, in self-sufficiency, in freedom from desire. Their provocations had a purpose: to wake people up, to demonstrate that happiness doesn't depend on social status or material wealth. But what's the ethical framework of our modern provocateurs? What are they trying to wake us up to? Trump's provocations? Do they serve a philosophical purpose, or are they simply tools for accumulating political power? When he violates norms, is he liberating us from arbitrary constraints, or is he destroying necessary guardrails? Musk's boundary pushing, is it visionary courage, or is it the recklessness of someone who's never faced real consequences? When he rejects expert consensus, is he thinking independently, or is he simply indulging his own ego? Tate's rejection of modern values around gender and consent. Is this philosophical courage, or is it justification for exploitation? The difference, I think, comes down to this. The ancient Cynics rejected social conventions that prevented human flourishing. They lived simply to demonstrate that simplicity could bring happiness. Their provocations were in service of human liberation. But our modern Cynics, what are they liberating us toward? More consumption, more polarization, more worship of wealth and power. They use the language of freedom and authenticity, but they're selling products. Political power, electric cars, online courses on masculinity. The ancient Cynics had nothing to sell. That's the difference. Diogenes told Alexander the Great to get out of his sunlight because he genuinely wanted nothing from him. Can we say the same about our modern provocateurs? Or are they performing outsider status while desperately seeking the validation and the power of the ultimate insiders? So where does this leave us? I think we're living through a moment of profound confusion about authenticity. We're so exhausted by political correctness, by corporate speak, by the carefully managed personas of traditional public figures, that we're drawn to anyone who seems real, anyone who seems to be speaking uncomfortable truths. And Trump, Musk, and Tate, whatever else they are, do seem real in a way that many public figures don't. They say what they think. They don't apologize. They don't manage their image in conventional ways. But realness isn't the same as truth. Provocation isn't the same as wisdom. And rejecting social conventions isn't inherently liberating. It depends entirely on what you're rejecting them for. The ancient Cynics asked, "What do you really need to be happy?" Our modern Cynics ask, "What can you get away with?" That's the difference between philosophy and trolling. The ancient Cynics lived their philosophy at personal cost. Our modern Cynics profit from theirs. That's the difference between courage and performance. The ancient Cynics wanted to free you from desire. Our modern Cynics want you to desire what they're selling. That's the difference between liberation and manipulation. But here's what I think is true. We need provocateurs. We need people who violate norms, who ask uncomfortable questions, who live differently. Every society needs its Diogenes, holding up a lamp in daylight, looking for an honest man. The question is, are we looking at modern Diogenes? Or are we looking at people who've learned to dress like Diogenes while living like Alexander? I don't have a final answer. I'm not sure there is one. But I think the question itself, the act of asking it, of thinking critically about the provocateurs we're drawn to, that might be the most cynic thing we can do. After all, Diogenes didn't want followers. He wanted people to think for themselves. I'm Adrian Vale. Thanks for wandering with me through these ideas. Now go think for yourself, and maybe be a little skeptical of anyone who tells you they're the only one brave enough to tell you the truth. That includes me.